Let me start now by introducing President Jin of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. President Jin, we're very grateful that you're here to speak to us. You are one of the primary people responsible for India's Belt and Road Initiative, China's external economic policy. And of course, total funding, as we read about it in the US, has been in the order of $50 to $100 billion a year. About 2/3 of that financing goes to power and transport, with real benefits to the local countries who are on the receiving end of those loans. Of course, as you know, President Jin, many in the US and Europe are watching this policy with some trepidation, not necessarily the AIIB investments, but other Chinese Belt and Road investments. And there are a lot of arguments in the US about whether this is a debt trap for poor countries, whether environmental and labor standards are not high. I know the AIIB tries to conduct itself with the highest possible standards. It's also, frankly, a potential area of cooperation between the US and China, and we're desperately looking for those between our two great countries. I have heard anecdotally, and I'm sure you'll discuss it with David Barboza, that China for the first time isn't going to be financing coal-fired power plants, and that you're planning some big economic investments in Afghanistan, where of course the United States is pulling back a little bit. President Jin Liqun needs very little introduction. Before he led the AIIB, he served as the chair of China International Capital Corporation, and also was the chair of the supervisory board of the China Investment Corporation, and the ranking vice president of the Asia Development Bank. So a long, long distinguished career in the government, also in the private sector. And as David and President Jin and I were discussing before, a graduate of Boston University, just like David. David, of course, is the co-founder and staff writer of The Wire, and formerly foreign correspondent at the New York Times, where he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. And of course, David was also the New York Times Shanghai bureau chief. So David, with that, I will let you take it away. Thank you.
Great, thank you for having me here. President Jin Liqun, wonderful to meet you. Ni hao. I would like to open up with a question, sort of a broad question about the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's a relatively young multilateral institution, emerging though at a time when there are growing doubts about globalization and multilateralism. Can you tell us how the bank is forging ahead in trying to address the issues of building and development in Asia at a time when people are growing a little concerned or even a little skeptical about the value and benefits of globalization or multilateralism?
Thank you, David. It's great, my great pleasure and honor to be invited to attend this Aspen conference. And I think it's very much important for us to communicate with the broad audience in the United States and elsewhere. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was up and running in January 16, 2016, after roughly 2 years of preparation. We started with 57 founding members from almost all of the countries in this world, from all of the continents. And now we have 103 members with 87 full members, which means they have ratified the Articles of Agreement and paid their first installments. Now, the question first is, why should we set up a new bank, multilateral development bank, when we already had the World Bank, ADB, EBRD, and all these regional development banks? Secondly, given the validity of such a new institution, what are the new features of such kind of institution to justify its existence, its raison d'etre? And the third question is this bank going to undercut the World Bank and other regional banks? Is this going to be an institution which would have head-on collision with existing institutions. And the last question, does China have an axe to grind in creating such kind of institution? I think all these are legitimate concerns until all these issues were fully clarified. First of all, as you know, the World Bank and all the other regional development banks have done wonderful things over the last 7 decades, half a century, but we are in the 21st century. And there is such a need for a new development bank which can fill in the gap left by some of these institutions, which is investing in infrastructure. It does not mean that World Bank and AIIB do not invest in infrastructure. They do a lot of things, but with limited resources. And when they invest in poverty reduction, social, and all these kind of things, we need a new bank which can pick up the slack. The second issue is how we could build this bank by a very high standards so that AIIB would cooperate with the World Bank and other institutions based on the same standards, safeguard standards. And the issue whether China has some political motivation, I think it makes no sense to argue or debate on this. You just watch the way China, as the biggest shareholder, plays its role in this institution. So 5 years and a half, we've seen we being recognized as a multilateral development institution, and we work wonderfully well with the World Bank, AIIB, EBRD, and all these development shareholders and stakeholders. So I think now we basically answer the question why there should be a new bank and whether this bank would be cooperating with the existing institutions rather than undercutting them.
Right. Can I ask you again, though, about the idea of multilateralism and globalization now? That has been a tremendous trend over the last few decades. Now, in the last few years, there have been some questions. Is globalization good? Is having a multilateral system, does that really work to the benefits? Do you have any answer to that, those skeptics or doubts?
I think we are grappling with these issues almost every day. I do believe multilateralism is the key to the solution a lot of issues. Multilateralism is the answer, is the solution, not a question, not a problem. But why have there been such kind of skepticism and doubts and questions about globalization, multilateralism? I think this is partly because of the fact that the changed balance of the economic power between developing and developed countries of the last 4 decades has created some misconception that globalization has created problems for developed countries, which is certainly not true. And recently, you may have heard a lot of rhetorics about decoupling. Okay, decoupling advocated by some people in developed countries, from China, from other developing countries, which seems to be more competitive throughout the last decades or so. My view is we should understand globalized economy is win-win for all of the participants. Multilateralism is the answer to a lot of issues. This is the historical trend. Nobody can stop it. Okay, it works like a juggernaut. It's pushing forward by the law of economics. But on the other hand, there are quite some evidence indicating that probably some middle-class people in developed countries see their living standard stagnated. And they also see the living standard of many developing countries going up. So, because of this kind of a perception, people question the multilateral economy, globalized economy, multilateralism are really working in favor of the middle class in the United States or the developing countries. So it's easy on the prima facie evidence to find a captive audience in the middle class whose living standard has been stagnated. But on the other hand, you should understand the wealth of these developed countries, including the United States, has been increasing over the last decades. It's increasing in absolute terms. So if there's any problem, it's the deficiency in the policies, domestic policies. It's the lacking in the actions to address income redistribution. So globalization is not culprit. So people who are responsible for this should not deflect blame for its own policy failures. Maybe no government in this world could be free from mistakes. I think it's all right. But what is important is to make corrections, try to make up for these kind of deficiencies as much as possible. So my view is we need to look at the hard facts and evidence to see the living standard is improving in the developed countries in general. Give you some of the examples. China can now afford to import huge amount of manufactured goods at the high end from the United States, aircrafts, and a lot of other things. And it can also import huge amount of agricultural products. Wine consumption in China is good news for Napa Valley, right? You cannot possibly imagine the Chinese common people could afford to drink wine from Napa Valley, could drink beef, could take beef, enjoy beef or dairy products, or many other kind of things from the United States. China could afford to consume this. Of course, it's due to their export to the United States. But on the other hand, you see the low-cost, inexpensive consumer goods have been able to sustain the very high living standard in the United States. So we should understand, because of the globalized economy, developing countries are improving their living standard. It's more conspicuous, probably, to see the changing of the life in these countries, far more than what's happening in the United States or the developed countries. But it's wrong to believe that this is zero-sum game. You are going up, we are going down. I don't think that's right.
Okay. You brought up the word I was a little reluctant to bring up, which is decoupling, which a lot of people have been talking about, the potential for decoupling. How does that affect, I mean, just the idea that there could be some decoupling, how does that affect your work at the bank in trying to, sort of build bridges if people are talking about decoupling or creating different zones of economic interests? How does that affect you?
As a multilateral development bank, our job is to bring the countries together, to help them work together in close collaboration to improve the economic and social development. And this is our mission. This is our mandate. This is our job. So we are not directly affected by the so-called decoupling. At least so far, it remains in rhetoric. So decoupling is so far more rhetoric than action. But still, I think we should be on the watch out for the risks of major economies sliding towards decoupling to a certain extent, or even a very serious extent, even if it's not a clear-cut or complete decoupling. I think on the one hand, it's not easy really for the economies to say farewell to each other. On the other hand, there is a real risk of decoupling. But I would like to point it out, man-made disasters did not happen because people who pushed it hard did not know the consequences of their irrational action. Rather, disasters happened because people did not foresee the magnitude of such disasters and even cynically make it happen until it was too late. So we need to be careful about that. On the one hand, I do believe by the law of economics, decoupling is not that easy. On the other hand, politics may play a role in this regard. So it's crucial, in my view, to forewarn a global catastrophe and bring the general public to fully appreciate the impact of decoupling on their livelihood. Now, there should be no market for those who are trumpeting decoupling for whatever their motivation. But public awareness of the catastrophe, in my view, is a huge retardant to the prairie fire of intractable decoupling once kick off. So I like to point out, on the one hand, decoupling is a real risk. On the other, it may not be that easy, but perception could be working one way or the other, right? Now, let's try to help people understand the consequences of the decoupling.
Sure. You say it's a threat, it's a danger. It probably is not a good thing if there was this decoupling, and it's possibly very difficult to carry out. Do you actually see that day to day with the infrastructure bank, that it's actually already happening in some regards, or does it affect what the bank does or deals that the bank makes, or in any way? Do you see it on the ground yet?
I think this bank, as you know, this bank's job is to promote infrastructure development in many of our members, developing members in Asia, in Central Asia, South Asia, in North Africa, and we are also doing something in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. So far, our job is a little bit distant from the so-called decoupling. But if decoupling really materializes, that definitely would have huge implications for the countries we support. Because the developing countries would face a completely different global economic landscape. And they would find it very hard to handle the very tough situation. So I've been trying my very best to advocate global cooperation, regional cooperation, and our investment in infrastructure, connectivity should bring the countries together. Okay, now, what have we been doing to reinforce the idea of win-win through cooperation is to be inclusive, is going to be involving all of the countries, regardless of membership in this bank. Now, if decoupling materializes, can you imagine whether the American business companies, the financial institutions can work in China or other Asian countries? It will be certainly impossible. So we don't want to see this happen. Now, this bank, as a global institution, multilateral development institution, has been pushing very hard for cooperation. And we have maintained very good relationship with the United States, regulatory bodies, the governmental institutions, and particularly in the private sector. Let me run down the catalog of our cooperation with the Americans. We have hired at least one US bank as the lead manager in each benchmark bond we have issued so far. And I have traded with 5 US banks to arrange 17 bond private placements for a combined equivalent amount of $737 million US dollars. Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Citi, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, MS. And we bank with one US entity, Bank New York Mellon, for our US dollar cash account to manage both investment loans and treasury operations, G10 currencies and investments in money market funds. And we have also signed ISDA, International Swaps and Derivatives Association, ISDA master agreement with associated entity to 3 US banks, Bank America, Merrill Lynch, GSI, JP Morgan. And these supported 21 executed swaps for a combined notional $10 billion. Negotiations are ongoing to sign 2 further ISDA with US counterparts. Mm-hmm. So we've been doing, I want to stop here. We've been doing a long, we have a long list of cooperation with Americans, even though the United States is not our member. Right. And we have Americans taking very important positions in our institution. So BlackRock, Goldman, and they all understand why we should stay together, right? Because we do not offer opportunities for the borrowing countries of this bank. We offer opportunities to major financial institutions in the United States, in Europe. And we also invite American businesses to participate in international competitive bidding for contracts. So what we've been aiming at is to bring countries together, bring people together, and bring the companies together to see that we all have the benefits from this. So if there's decoupling, if people don't talk to each other, if there's a real severance, I think all the benefits accruing to the United States, to China, to many other countries would be wiped out altogether.
Right. President Jin, what about, we haven't yet talked about COVID, its effect on the bank, or how it may reshape your initiatives there. Can you talk a little about what effect COVID had? I mean, you're in infrastructure and development. That has to have halted lots of things. Maybe there's more of an interest in healthcare. Can you give us a little sense of how COVID reshapes such a young institution?
Thank you very much for the question. I can talk a little bit about the special feature of this bank. Our bank is agile, adaptive, and responsive. When we negotiated the Articles Agreement starting from 2014, I was the first, the head of the Chinese Working Group. Then I was elected to be the Secretary General of the Interim Multilateral Secretariat. So we negotiated with the 57 founding members, prospective founding members, about the Articles Agreement, about the mandate and mission of this institution. By its title, the bank is certainly mandated to invest in infrastructure. But if you look at the Articles Agreement, we phrase the mission in such a way that the bank is to promote broad-based economic and social development through investment in infrastructure and other productive sectors. So we do not focus very narrow on infrastructure in the strictest sense of the term. And I added the words infrastructure and other productive sectors. So in a negotiation, by the way, the chief counsel is an American lady. Our chief counsel for the negotiation, American lady. That was quite a surprise to many people. China initiated this bank, and some people in the United States may not like it, but we engage an American lawyer to work for us. So people ask me, Mr. Jin, what do you mean by other productive sectors? We are supposed to build a bank focused on infrastructure investment. And what do you mean by that? And I said, other productive sectors is other productive sectors, period. Now, all of a sudden, we find we are faced with the formidable challenge of COVID-19 pandemic. What should we do? My view is we certainly should probably slow down a little bit the normal infrastructure projects financing and to focus momentarily on dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. My belief is healthcare is social infrastructure. Healthcare is important. No nation is productive unless it's healthy. Right. So we are not deviating from the Articles of Agreement. Healthcare is part of the other productive sectors. So after the outbreak of the COVID-19, we focused very much on the policy lending, budget support to the countries who came to us for help. And in 2020, we invested $7 billion in dealing with COVID-19 so as to help these countries to get back on their feet as soon as possible and to go back to the regular infrastructure projects moving forward. However, COVID-19 pandemic really alerts us to the importance of the social infrastructure. So in the future, even though we go back to the normal infrastructure investment, we will still allocate a suitable proportion of resources to build up the healthcare system of so many countries in our bank.
I didn't ask you about the Belt and Road, but that comes up often with the Asia Infrastructure Bank. What is your relationship or involvement in the Belt and Road Initiative? How is it linked in any way to the Asia Infrastructure Bank, and how is it going?
I think there's lots of confusion between the Belt and Road Initiative and the AIIB. Now, when I was asked this question, I often ask them the question, if Belt and Road Initiative and the AIIB are one and the same thing, why should we have two initiatives? Right. They are different, but Belt and Road and AIIB share more or less the same objective of promoting connectivity, promoting globalized regional economy. But the way they work is different. Belt and Road Program Initiative is a platform. President Xi highlighted the point. Belt and Road Initiative is based on broad-based consultation, joint construction, and shared benefit. So on this platform, any country, any company who is willing to cooperate is welcome to work together, right? AIIB is a multilateral development bank with its governance structure, board of governors, board of directors, management. It's an institution which operates by its playbook, by its governance standards. So it's an institution. It's a bank. It's not the platform. That's the difference. But we share the objective of promoting connectivity. And this bank does not pick projects from China or from any other country. We process project operations proposed to us by the client members. Now, for instance, Vietnam, Cambodia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they came to us and proposing the projects for our processing. So we do not fix labels. Oh, this is Belt Road project, this is not. We don't fix labels. As long as the projects are proposed to us for our processing, we do it by our standards through rigorous review of the environmental, social issues. Now, if we contribute to the Belt and Road Initiative, we do it this way. Any project which are considered Belt Road proposed to us for our financing will be done by our very high standards. And we can lend credibility to Belt and Road programs, initiatives by the very high standards we uphold, right? So that's the difference. Now, when we have almost all of the European countries and Canada and some Asian countries, geographically, but culturally, they are European countries like Australia and New Zealand, and OECD countries like Korea and Singapore. Now, when we have all these countries, members, who serve as the best guardians of this institution, and we can convince the rest of the world that this bank works by the same high standards, exactly like that of the World Bank, ADB, or other institutions. So that is the relationship and difference between Belt Road Initiative and this bank. I'm fully supportive of Belt Road Initiative, but I think the best way I support this is to do a good job in bringing these projects to fruition by high standards.
Thank you. Let me ask you just a little about the private sector. You're involved in infrastructure development, in connectivity. How do you bring in the private sector? You mentioned major investment banks and global banks. What about private companies, part of the supply chains, or building this infrastructure? How do you draw them in to be a partner with the AIIB?
We have already tried our very best to mobilize private sector resources to promote infrastructure and other productive sectors. In the corporate strategy, which was approved by the board last year, we aim at achieving 50% of the financing in the private sector by 2030. As you may know, we aim at 50% of the financing for climate change mitigation and adaptation by 2025. But moving here to 2030, bringing the private investors into our investment is also a very challenging task for the reasons. First of all, infrastructure projects normally have a long gestation period, not without risks. So it is not so easy to persuade private sector investors to join us in investing in infrastructure. Probably they have to wait for quite a number of years to get their return back. That is difficult part. But I think there's also something which could be attractive to them. When we work with the host governments to create an enabling environment for private investment, the private sector investor should feel comfortable when they work with us because they can be assured of a fair deal. They should not be worried about discrimination or whimsical, perverse policy changes. So that is the attraction of working with the multilateral development institutions. Secondly, I think the challenge is also the different, I think, time frame. We normally can stay in an investment in a project for many years. They probably do not. So working with them, we can also try to help them by providing them early exit if they want to leave, and then we pick up the real maturity. So we've been doing this to the extent possible. But of course, the recent economic downturn because of the financial and economic crisis, which was, I think, still the tail of the 2008 to 2009 crisis, plus the pandemic. As you see, a lot of private sector projects seem to be in trouble. And you see the rising NPLs of even the multilateral institutions who focus on private sector operations. We have to be very much careful about that. But we are young, we are new, and our portfolio in private sector is still very much limited. But I don't think we should be shy of the investment in private sector, and instead we should do our very good job and improving the due diligence and working well with all of these people in investing in infrastructure.
Thank you, President Jin. I'm going to turn over to Anja. I think there are some questions from the audience for you, so if you can hold on one second.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, President Jin, for that. What the AIIB actually does around the world is not very well understood in the United States. So you were very clear in explaining it. Thank you. I have a number of questions from the audience. Some I'll actually call up. But let me start with a question that came in by writing from Raj Shah, who of course used to run USAID, and Eileen O'Connor, who are both now at the Rockefeller Foundation, and several others asked similar questions. So I'll combine them. Also Hernan Villagran. And you started addressing it, but just could you say more clearly what exactly the AIIB is doing on creative, green, environmentally friendly financing? And what specifically are you doing to help China meet its net zero targets for carbon emissions?
Well, we, as you see, we aim at achieving 50% of the financing for climate change by 2025. Now, we have already achieved about 40% of financing for climate change. We make it very clear from the very beginning that infrastructure investment in today's world should be done in a way very much different from what it used to be. We have to do it in an environmental benign way. Infrastructure investment should help reduce emissions rather than to increase it. So we focus very much on renewables, and we invest in mass transit system to reduce the driving of individual cars. And all these kind of things, in my view, are very much important. We want to take an integrated approach to the climate mitigation and adaptation. With regard to China, we are certainly very much encouraged by the Chinese leaders' declaration that China would reach carbon peaking by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. For such a populous country with per capita fossil fuel consumption is way below that of the developed countries, I think it's a monumental effort to achieve that ambition. So we certainly wish China all the best, but Chinese government, in my view, can do it if it's determined to do it. We do not provide a lot of resources to China, very, very insignificant, because China, as the biggest shareholder, does not want to take too much money from this bank, as it made it very much clear from the beginning. But as the president, I want to make some loans to China for the purpose of dealing with COVID-19, for the purpose of improving the quality of our assets. So when the quality of assets improves, we can afford to lend more to poor, low-income countries. So anyway, we were still doing things in China. But basically, our economics department is providing advisory services to China to help them to find a very good approach to achieving the net zero by 2060. So our support is basically in the advisory area rather than in financing.
Great. I'm going to call up Callie Oburn, who's a former Scowcroft fellow here at Aspen, to ask her question. But while we call her up, just one clarifying question, President Jin. When you say 40% of financing of the AIIB is for climate change, you mean that's clean technology projects?
Basically, it's clean technology, but as I said, energy efficiency, all the projects which can cut down on emissions are also counted towards this climate financing. But we are now working on the very important issue of Paris alignment. We're trying to work on this in collaboration with other MDBs like the World Bank ADB. And so we would try to achieve the Paris alignment by more or less this same timetable. But you see, you need to deal with climate change in a way which would be broad enough to help these countries. Of course, renewables financing is definitely climate change mitigation, but to reduce the emissions through energy efficiency, through mass transit system rather than driving individual cars, and all these are very much important. But we are working on the methodology and with other institutions to probably come up with a better, solution for the definition of the climate change mitigation.
Thank you very much. We have one last question from Callie Oburn, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you. Callie.
Thank you so much, President Jin, for being here with us. I wanted to ask, in September of last year, you announced that the AIIB would not invest in coal-fired power plants, but you also announced that the AIIB would not invest in related infrastructure to coal-fired power plants. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about this. How will the AIIB go about actually pursuing this in terms of not investing in related infrastructure? And how was this announcement met with by the shareholders? Was it met with resistance or kind of with welcome? And how will the AIIB actually go about including this new policy in the AIIB's energy investment strategy?
Thank you. It's a very good question. Our energy strategy was formulated and approved by the board in 2017, and roughly 18 months after the bank was up and running. And in the energy strategy, there was a provision for coal-firing power plants. So we did not rule out coal in this energy strategy, but setting a very tough conditions for coal projects. In reality, we never ever put any coal-firing projects in our pipeline. We never did it, in spite of this provision. The reason is many developing countries still at that time expected the MDBs to help them develop coal projects by very high standards, clean coal technology. But we were more prudent than what is stipulated in the energy strategy. And for instance, we turned down a project of a developing country. It's a project of power transmission. This power transmission would lead to a coal-firing power plant. That coal-firing power plant was built with clean technology, with Western countries' technology. We still turn it down because this transmission line would be linked to a coal-firing power plant. That's why I said we will not finance any coal project or any other project which is functionally related to coal. And that's what we did. So next year, we may review or upgrade the energy strategy. And my view is, this is what I announced, my view is in a new energy strategy, updated strategy, coal definitely would be out.
Thank you very much, Callie. Thank you very much, President Jin, for those remarks, especially so late at night for you in Beijing. And thank you, David, for your excellent moderating.